It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm quite excited to be with a group of folks who are in the high technology business, because we live in a world that is being fundamentally changed and transformed by technology, and you're all in the right place at the right time. Now, today I have a really interesting challenge, and that is to really talk to you about two topics at once. One, this conversation that's going on around digital transformation that I help lead and teach at INSEAD, but this other that is around innovation. Before I dig in too deep, it was a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. I am indeed an American in Paris, if there is a cliche, but I am a professor at INSEAD. We are a global business school with campuses in France, Singapore, Abu Dhabi, and San Francisco. And we really see our job as being about how does business happen for the world. And so I want to tell you just briefly to introduce myself. Yes, I have worked in industry. I've worked in real companies before I went back to Stanford to do my PhD. So I understand how the real world works. And what I wanted to understand was innovation in established companies. And so I've published a series of books that Harvard has published, articles in Forbes and Harvard Business Review and elsewhere on this question of how do we get ideas? How do we test ideas? How do we win support for our ideas? And as part of that, I've had the good luck of getting to interview people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but also innovators in established companies to understand how they operate. In addition to that, I lead our practice at INSEAD on digital transformation. Really, I would say underneath that is a deeper set of academic work about how technology changes the world. So when I see some of your businesses, lasers has been one of our favorite industries to study, to understand how technologies emerge, how they spread, and how companies capture value from them. But I'm going to talk today more about this digital transformation piece. If I have a claim to fame, it's that the founders of Instagram were my students. But you should know that I have 4 children and they have become teenagers, and now they stare all day at their Instagram. And so now I kind of curse the founders of Instagram for what they did to me, because they turned me into that father who's like, get off your phone, get off your phone. So now you can curse me too if you've learned one thing. So I need you to buckle your seatbelts. This is not a good time to be trying to do your email at the same time as listening in, because I'm really going to throw a lot at you. As I said, first, I want to unpack for you this whole conversation about digital transformation and how it's relevant both to your business, but also to your opportunities that you have to capture. And then number 2, talk about this continuous innovation piece, which has become such a necessary theme in our modern world. I'm going to move fast. So let's dive in to digital transformation. There's a fun joke going around right now, who led the digital transformation of your company? CEO, CTO, COVID-19. Most people say COVID-19. Because what this pandemic did is it forced many organizations to create digital channels where once they maybe had analog channels, and to speed up the process of digitization. Friends who are executives at Microsoft say things like, we've seen shifts we couldn't have imagined would happen in 5 years happening in 2 months. So this is one of the major themes created by the pandemic, and that will continue. And why will it continue? Well, sometimes when you hear about digital transformation, you might be tempted to think, come on, maybe this is a little bit of a fad. I mean, you hear stuff like Snapchat being valued at $29 billion when they IPO. I mean, I'm old enough to kind of feel like that's kind of a joke, right? But don't let those things dissuade you from the underlying foundational forces behind digital transformation. And if I had to say one thing, I would say what we're talking about with this word is we're talking about the exponential growth in computing power and what that allows us to do, such that today we make as much progress in expanding computing power as in 1 hour as we do in the first 80 years of computing. And how is that manifest? Well, it's manifest in that a kid anywhere in the world with a smartphone has as much computing power as NASA had when they put somebody on the moon. And if you had an iPhone X or higher, you have more computing power than the first Cray supercomputer. If you have a Apple II series or higher watch on your wrist, you're wearing 2 million times more memory than the Apple I computer. And I remember the Apple II. So like, that's a lot. That's an incredible shift in our lifetimes. But it's not just a technology shift, my friends. It is also a consumer shift. So consumers are getting faster at adopting and abandoning technologies, and our expectations. And you may say, well, I'm in a B2B world, but what we do in our consumer life tends to bleed over into our business life. And let me give you a sense of this pace of change. So the DVD player used to be the fastest adopted consumer electronics device in history. They sold 300,000 units in 1 year and broke all the records. Now compare that to something like the iPad. It sold 3 million units, 10 times as many units in a quarter of the time. And then as we shift into digital products, it gets even more extreme. Something like a Pokemon Go, 500 million downloads in 2 months, and at one point generating $18 million a day for a free app. And you may say, oh yeah, but a lot of people abandoned it. Yes, but a lot of people didn't, and they're doing like $1 billion in revenue. That's pretty insane. So consumers, it's not only that we adopt faster, it's that our expectations for speed, for ease, for at cost have changed. So what digital is doing though, beyond just kind of this technology, is it's creating new points of attack into old industries. For example, think about in the old days, if you wanted, I'm here in Paris, if I wanted to go to London, I need to change my euros for pounds. In the old days, I had to go to a bank. I had to pay a very large fee to essentially have the bank coordinate with their bank over in London and to transfer my euros into pounds. Well, a startup called TransferWise had this idea. Why do you have to pay that big fee? What if you could just allow two people, one with euros, one with pounds, to meet on the street corner and swap money? You get rid of the whole huge fee. Now, of course, that's not possible. But with a digital platform, you could essentially allow those people to meet digitally and swap. And so what TransferWise is effectively a platform for swapping currency. Now they charge a fee, but it's 80% of what your bank used to charge you. And suddenly banks who are like, hey, that was my business, I was making a lot of money on it, find themselves under attack because digital lowers the barriers to create, connect, and interact. Likewise, it's opening channels into industries we thought were closed. Think about the automobile industry 15 years ago. It certainly didn't feel very lively, but with connected cars, either because there's a connection built into the dashboard, say like in a BMW, or because somebody plugs a phone onto their dashboard, suddenly all these new digital services can be brought to bear on the automobile experience. And in fact, at Consumer Electronics Show, connected cars is one of the biggest categories. I mean, who could have imagined that would have been true 15 years ago? But it is today. Digital is also creating new channels, new connections, new interactions, both in the B2C and the B2B world. I'll give you a B2C example because it's fun. This gentleman in South Korea is taking a photo of the grocery store shelf. Maybe I'll add to your conversation last night because you say that seems like kind of strange behavior until you back up and see this Tesco initiative at the subway. And essentially he takes photos of what he wants delivered to his apartment later on, an entirely new distribution channel for a grocery store. It's transforming activities, even in high technology. Think about an organization like NASA. NASA is, about as high tech as they get. One of the things they do is they hire scientists, PhDs, and those PhDs get to work in R&D to solve problems. What has digital done for them? Well, it's allowed them to open up to an activity we call crowdsourcing. That is, using a digital platform, you take a problem and you open it up to the crowd and see if somebody out there in the crowd has a solution. And you may say, oh, well, Nathan, that works for cute little, digital apps, but not for high tech. Think again. I'll give you an example of one of the problems they've been able to solve. Clearly, when there are solar flares, it creates problems for communication in space. Generations of heliologists have been working on solving the challenge of how do you predict solar flares. Nobody had really come up with a great solution. They put this problem on the crowdfunding platform, and some retired engineer in New England, not even in that space, came up with a solution for better predicting solar flares. And it's really challenged the way that NASA thinks about some of their core activities. Is it something we do, or is it something we do in partnership with others? So I've tried to give you a sense of how digital transformation is a real thing. I don't want to scare you, though, because one of the things that can happen when I go through some of those slides and tell you how digital is bringing down the barriers to create, connect, and transact and interact is you can get afraid, and you could make the mistake of thinking, oh my gosh, my company is going to get swallowed. We need to go become Google or Facebook. And like, to be honest with you, nothing could be further from the truth. So what then is digital transformation? And it has been a really thorny question to answer for folks. In fact, I was in Switzerland with a big international company and had this big long lunch with the senior executives. And it took the whole lunch for them to kind of get comfortable and finally reveal the dirty secret. And that is, one of the senior vice presidents said, Nathan, we have working committees on digital transformation. We have a digital transformation vision, but nobody can tell me what it actually is. Like, what is it? And, I don't blame his confusion. And if you share some of that confusion, my hope is to clarify it, but with a caveat. And that is that digital transformation means something different for every industry. And even within an industry, digital transformation can mean something different for different firms because it's a strategy choice. With that said, what are some of the, how could I unpack what I mean when I say digital transformation? Let me try to take a couple slices or lenses on it. So to me, digital transformation is about the set of opportunities enabled by several big shifts. The first is in computing. The shift in computing, large and small. Now you may say, oh, Nathan, we've had computers for decades. True. What's different is that the computers, and they're now supercomputers, are sitting in our pockets. They're sitting on our wrists. They're embedded in devices. It's computing in the cloud. And the question is, what does that allow us to do? Let me give you an example. A lot of people have talked about Uber, or if you live somewhere else in the world, Didi or Grab. It's that ride-sharing platform that has become so popular. This idea that there's people willing to give rides and there's people who need rides. We could match them up and we could make money with ride share. That opportunity has always existed. You could have created Uber 30 years ago. Now, here's what it would have looked like 30 years ago. You would need to get a list of friends who are willing to give rides. You'd have maybe written down on pen and paper all their names and phone numbers. You'd need to post a bunch of posters around town so that, say, when somebody arrives at the train station, they see your phone number, they call you up, and then you would have to, on a separate phone line, one by one, dial your friends until, let's say, friend number 6 picks up. And you say, oh, great, there's somebody at the train station. Would you go pick them up? And they say, oh, wait, I'm on the other side of town. And you begin to see some of the logistics challenges, some of the friction that would make that a dumb idea 30 years ago. Sorry to say it that way, or a hard idea to execute at least. But when you have a supercomputer sitting in somebody's pocket with GPS location and a digital platform that can do that matching between thousands of people instantaneously and conduct the payments instantaneously, suddenly Uber and ride sharing is a big opportunity. So the question is, what do these shifts enable us to do? And it's not just shifts in computing, it's shifts in software. Now we've had software for decades. What's the shift I'm talking about? It's the biggest of them is what we call application program interfaces, or APIs. essentially interfaces that allow programs and data to work together so we can bridge these silos between organizations and applications. So APIs are allowing us to connect and do things we could never do before. But it's a little more than that. I mean, there's also virtualization. That is that in the past, you needed a specialized piece of hardware to conduct a function. And today you can mimic that function with software. It's also the modularity that is introduced by API thinking and software. It's also that software is embedded in so many devices. So there's many forces going into this. It's also connectivity. That connectivity has become essentially ubiquitous in most parts of the world. We forget that a mere 20 years ago, since Mark is in Boston, well, in Massachusetts, we forget that the city of Boston 20 years ago was a tech hub, and yet only 50% of people had access to the internet, and that was dial-up. Nobody had it on a phone. Only 25% of people had mobile phones back then. And then lastly, data. And it's data produced by sensors, data produced by websites, data produced by our activities, and what can we do with this? So one way to think about digital transformation is just waking up to these opportunities enabled by these forces. Now, I will say it's a little more than that. It's compounded by the fact that there are new technologies emerging, some of which could be as general purpose as the internet. So things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, blockchain, automation, mixed reality, additive manufacturing, cloud computing. I mean, we could go on. We could talk about 5G. We could talk about materials, innovations. I mean, there's many, many technologies. These just multiply the opportunities. So I've really thrown a lot at you guys. I've tried to say that digital transformation matters. It fundamentally brings down the barriers to create, connect, transact, and interact. And that shift allows lots and lots of opportunities. But maybe I could make this more tangible for you by giving you two company examples, companies that have gone through digital transformation, and try to bring home what digital transformation really means for established companies. So the first, the two companies I'm going to use are archetypes, meaning that they represent a type of digital transformation I've seen in many other instances. So if you don't like the company itself, let's say you hate MasterCard, okay, I'm sorry, but it is like many others that I've studied. So the first big archetype that I've seen of what digital transformation means for established companies is well represented by the MasterCard experience. So MasterCard, as you know, is a payments company. They essentially allow payments between consumers like you and me and the merchants who want to take payment. And a few years ago, a new CEO came in, AJ Banga, and he had this kind of strategic insight. He said, only 15% of the world's payments are completed by card. 85% of the world's payments are in cash. And yet we're spending billions of dollars competing with Visa and Amex for a 15% slice of the pie. Why don't we go after the 85% slice of the pie that is cash? And that was a big vision. It wasn't clear exactly what that meant to execute. And so they started running a bunch of experiments. And as they ran those experiments, one thing they discovered is that, yes, it was good to compete with cash, but every time they replaced a payment with a cash payment with a card payment, it wasn't just about that payment transaction. It was also about the data. And what can we do with that data? And I'll give you some examples of some discoveries they started to make. So if you've been to London, you know that to get on the tube, you have to stand in line and buy a separate card called an Oyster card, load money onto the card, use that Oyster card to travel on the tube. Can't just go in. So MasterCard partnered with Transport for London and Cubic Transportation Systems to create a like an instant payment system. So instead of standing in line for the Oyster card, you can just pull out your credit card, tap it as you go in. The payment happens in an instant, so that by the time your leg hits that bar of the turnstile, you're walking through. Eliminates a step. Just eliminating that step saves Transport for London £100 million a year in collection expenses. But MasterCard realizes something interesting. He said, wait a minute, we got all this data about how people are moving on the tube. And not only that, if we combine it with like our other data, because we know a lot of, Nathan just bought a coffee before he got on the tube, we can actually use that to create a picture of how demand flows. And if we could shift demand away from peak times, not only would we make people happier, say, for example, by encouraging Nathan to buy his coffee after his commute, because there's a big rush coming, we could actually save Transport for London a lot more money. In fact, they estimated for every 1% shift in peak demand, they could save them £10 million in capital expenditures. Wow, that's a big shift. Another big thing they discovered, you and I maybe don't appreciate that when we go and book our hotel on a platform like booking.com, that creates a bit of a job for the hotel, because at the end of the month, booking.com sends a hotel, say a Marriott, a lump sum payment, and there's this huge and expensive reconciliation process for the hotel to kind of match payments to customers and kind of get a sense of what's really going on. In fact, it's a $600 billion expense. MasterCard started to think, well, what if we stopped thinking about plastic and started thinking about separating the plastic from the digital ID, and asked, what could we do with digital IDs? Oh, that's kind of interesting, right? So what they do is they attach a digital ID now to every transaction to automate that process and eliminate that cost from the industry. Now, I could go on and on with things they've done. If I could summarize what digital transformation has meant for MasterCard, it's that it was all about pursuing new opportunities in data infrastructure, digital IDs, taking that platform concept that is their card business and saying, how do we create platforms in other industries? So for example, they're creating a blockchain platform to trace supply chain origin. But the point is simply that for some companies, and for many companies, a big part of digital transformation is waking up to these new opportunities that are available to them in a digital world. Now, as I mentioned, that's just one archetype, right? That's not the whole story. There's another archetype that I do want to share with you. And this is a very different kind of digital transformation. This is a company, airline called AeroFlot. Some of you have flown on AeroFlot. If you flew on AeroFlot before 2009, my general kind of observation is people had miserable experiences. I have stories, firsthand stories of my executive students, for example, getting on this is again before 2009, getting on an AeroFlot plane, buckling up. And remember, this was on the days when we did get on airplanes, buckling up, taking off, and the seats falling over like dominoes because they hadn't been bolted properly to the floor. Or having to stay overnight in Moscow because the airline didn't have enough cash on hand to buy the next round of fuel. And I mean, I have horror story after horror story of AeroFlot. And this company in 2009 was in a tough situation. They were state-owned, very bureaucratic. They're in an industry with low margins, so not a lot of wiggle room to do new things. They have this horrible reputation. In fact, people used to say, Aero flop, because you're lucky to get out alive. And they're nearly bankrupt. Oh my gosh, what do you do in that situation? Well, they call in a new CEO, and the new CEO, fresh energy, and we're excited about that, but he has no airline experience. His only experience is actually in IT and telecom. And his first big move is to change the uniforms. And you're like, oh, I'm not sure that would be like my first move, right? Now, to be fair to him and to be fair to the story, he makes a lot of different changes. And if we look at, let's say, right before the pandemic, we see this incredible uplift in AeroFlot. So they carry a huge number more passengers. they are, the percentage of how full the plane is increases significantly, and every 1% increase is worth about 5 billion rubles. They triple their passenger load, and they decrease the number of staff to serve 1 million passengers from 1,700 to 700. Now, for those of you who are a little more empirically minded, you might be saying, yeah, but Nathan, that could just be a function of numbers. You carry more passengers, things look better. But remember how I said how bad they were? Let's keep in mind, like, no airline is fabulous, but they are able to improve their net promoter score, or the measure of passenger satisfaction, dramatically. And they're able to go from losing money almost every year to making money consistently. Now, that's a big change. And when we asked the CEO, how in the world did that happen? I got to be clear, there were a number of things that changed. They upgraded their fleet, they renegotiated their debts, but the CEO claims it was a digital transformation. But this digital transformation looks very different than MasterCard. In this digital transformation, one of the things they did is they said they looked back, they looked at all their processes. And the CEO said they realized that they had 176 different systems that were automating 35% of the business processes. Whoa, that's a lot of systems to automate not very many activities. So one of the first things that he focused on was asking, how do we automate business processes? How do we make it so we're not doing things with pen and paper, but they're happening automatically, they're happening digitally? And then they went out and they learned from others in their industry and others who are further down the digital transformation curve than they were, to say, what kind of things can we do to transform how we do things? And spoiler alert, it's not magic. So they do things like, in the past, the pilots would carry a bag onto the plane full of paper, manuals, forms to fill out. They'd fill out the forms in paper and then submit them, and they'd get processed. That's done. The pilots have electronic flight bags. Everything is provided to them and processed digitally. The crews also have a tablet that tells them who the passengers are. What do they want to be called? What do they like to eat? If the flight is late, what are their options to get somewhere else? They implement a intelligent voice platform produced by Nuance. That's the company that Microsoft just acquired. I wouldn't say it's anything magical, but they're using, of course, voice recognition and automation to decrease wait time to 30 seconds and to actually process 20% of calls automatically. And then most importantly, they're getting a window into what's going on in their business. I'm blowing that little picture up. It's the manager's monitor. And because they have digital sensors on everything, they create the process by which they can gather data about what's happening in their business. And they have 427 key indicators available to the top management team at all times of day about any slice of the business that they need. Now, tracking your key indicators isn't anything new. In fact, one of the big bank CEOs in Russia, when he heard this, said, "Oh, I have the same thing. I have a bunch of key indicators too." And the AeroFlot CEO said, "Really? How many people does it take you to get those key indicators?" And the bank CEO admitted it takes 80 people over a week to get that data. By contrast, in AeroFlot, this monitor, this is happening automatically. The data is flowing automatically. It doesn't take people. It doesn't take a week. The point here is that the AeroFlot looks a lot different than MasterCard, but it is still a digital transformation. And it is more about doing what you do differently, but doing it better using digital tools. And so as you walk away from today, one of the things I want you to be thinking about as you think about digital transformation as an opportunity for your company and what that means for your industry is to realize that digital transformation means, like the AeroFlot case, doing the things you already do, but doing them differently and better using digital tools. That means it's about transforming the core of what you do. That may require you to rethink some things. I mean, sometimes we can replace activities one for one, but sometimes we have to rethink things. I was sitting with, I interviewed one of the executive vice presidents at PayPal. We often think of PayPal as a digital company. We forget they were founded over 20 years ago to do email payments. And the world has changed for them as well. If you're sending money from one person to another via email, you actually have a lot of time to process that payment, to make sure it's compliant, it's not money laundering. But in today's world, think of that subway example, the tube example. Payments need to be processed instantly. And what PayPal found is that they had historically developed a payments and a regulatory division that operated separately, but to do instant payments, those had to be brought together. So when I say doing what you do, serving customers, the customers you serve today, better using digital tools, it can be a one-for-one replacement, but it can be a rethinking of how you do it. And great digital transformation is always built around serving customer needs. But with that said, I do want to acknowledge that digital transformation is also, like in the MasterCard case, about doing new and different things, about discovering the opportunities that are available to you, or even rethinking your existing opportunities. And it's that balance of the two. And where you should put the emphasis will depend on what type of company you are, where your customers are on the digital transformation curve, how much digital transformation you're facing in your industry. But I feel very convinced that the bar for playing in the future is going to be very much this transforming the core to do what you do better using digital tools. So with that said, I was trying to define what digital transformation meant. And I said it's about transforming the core and pursuing new opportunities. But with that said, I want to alert you to a few, specifically 3 kind of tectonic shifts that are going on in parallel, things that you need to be aware of. And the first shift is a shift from a world of products to a world of platforms. And when I say products, I mean products and services. And in the past, most of us could get away making products and services. But what's happening as digital brings down the barriers to connect and transact and interact, increasingly, that's misspelled, sorry about that, platforms, look at the article, platforms are playing an increasingly important role. And what do I mean by platform? A platform, think of Uber, think of Amazon, think of Airbnb. Platforms, what they do is they facilitate interaction between users. And so, I drew in all these beautiful blue arrows to inspire you that that's what a platform does. Platforms exist both in the B2C world and the B2B world. In the B2C world, it's usually platforms facilitate, like in an Uber, the transaction of getting a ride. In the B2B world, it tends to be more around coordination of workflows and activities. So a platform, an effort like GE Predix would be an example of a platform activity. B2B tends to be harder to create platforms because in a consumer world, the transactions tend to be pretty homogeneous. I mean, the difference between you and me wanting a ride is almost negligible. We both want a ride, just where we want to go is different. Whereas in a B2B world, the transactions, the workflows, the machinery involved, the software involved in it is much more heterogeneous. And so they tend to be harder to create, but there's still a lot of value there. So why do you care about platforms? Why should you care? Well, there's a couple forces that lead to the domination of a few platforms. The most important of these is what we call network effects. And that is the simple idea that as more people join, it gets more valuable. It's well illustrated by a telephone network. Like, for example, if myself and a few other friends are the only ones with a telephone, it has some value, but not as much value because there's so many people I can't reach on my telephone. But as more and more people join the telephone network, it gets more and more valuable for me. And that tendency to agglomerate around where there are more users leads to a winner-take-all effect. That winner-take-all effect is what's behind, the network effect, is what's behind why there are only 1 or 2 ride-sharing platforms in a city, why there are only a few search engines, why there are only, fill in the blank. Wherever you see 1 or 2 or 3 competitors, it tends to be because there's a network effect. And once a platform gets established, they have a lot of power. They have all the data that's flowing through. They can decide who gets to play on the platform and how. So for example, Amazon.com allows third parties to sell on their platform, but it's been empirically demonstrated that as soon as a third-party seller starts to sell something that gets really popular, Amazon comes in and offers a competitor and often takes over that category. So that's a lot of power. And as a result, 60 of the world's largest 100 companies earn most of their revenue from platforms. So as you think about digital transformation and what that means for you, I'm wanting you to think about, what is our platform strategy? How important are platforms in my industry? What's our strategy to play with them? And do we need to create them? So the second big shift, tectonic shift in the digital world, is from firms to ecosystems. So what's happening is in the past, you could do most things by yourself within the walls of your firm with some suppliers and maybe with some partnerships. Increasingly, as digital brings down the barriers to connect and transact and interact, the border between products, between activities, between industries are coming down and they're getting more connected. And there are more and more players in the ecosystem. By ecosystem, maybe take the example of this automobile, and I'm giving you a brief illustration of how the automobile industry ecosystem has opened up, and there are more players in the ecosystem. And it's harder and harder in the digital world to do it all yourself. Doesn't mean you can't, but increasingly there are more opportunities available where you need to work with the ecosystem, or you at least need to be paying attention to the ecosystem. And just to give you an example, Bosch wants to create kind of the Internet of Things for farmers, but in a digital world, they just can't do it all by themselves. They've got to bring together the farmers, the hardware providers, the interface providers, the installers, the folks who develop apps and features. All of that ecosystem has to be coordinated to create some value that is actually, that can then be captured. So second big shift is from just being able to pay attention to what you do to having to think more and more about the ecosystem. Then the third shift, the last shift I want to say about digital transformation is very simply a shift from traditional business models, your business model as it's existed for the last few years or decades, to what we could call digital business models. And here I have a picture of the business model canvas, which is just one of many tools to talk about what a business model is. It's about how a company creates and captures value. And the big theme here is that digital gives you so much more flexibility than you had in the past. And so it's opening up business model innovation opportunities. So it's changing the activities. It's removing layers, removing intermediaries. I mean, when Netflix produces their own content and distributes it to their phone, there's an entire industry of intermediaries that are being removed. There's a shift away from an asset sale business model only, like I sell you this product one time. It's a shift into subscription and service and freemium. It's a shift even in how we think about customers, to thinking about lengthening the lifetime customer value, the benefits of network effects, the learning cycles. It's a broader view of how value is created and captured. There's a shift from physical to digital. So it's not just physical products, but data and insight become sources of revenue. And also hybrids of old and new. So it's products and platforms. We've always been B2C, but suddenly we realize we can also do we've always been B2B, but suddenly we realize we can also be B2C. Like, that's becoming a real possibility. And as I mentioned, there's changes in accounting and allocation, and a shift from focusing purely on EBITDA right now to saying, well, what's the lifetime value of this customer? Because now I can actually track it and understand it and see the levers to increase that. Or, you make a huge transition to the cloud, or you're doing projects and activities using cloud-based computing. How do you allocate that? It's a shift in how we even think about the internal operations of the business. So you guys have been great. Hopefully I haven't put you to sleep, right? But I've been trying to give you the essence of digital transformation as a major theme that is going on in the world around you. It impacts your business, it impacts your customers, and it will be a conversation for a long time. And the big ideas were that digital transformation, although it's changing a lot of things, it is transforming the core of what we do so you can do what you do better using digital tools. Many of you serve customers that have critical and important needs, and those needs aren't going away. Google's not going to step in and do those needs, but you can serve those needs better using digital tools. But at the same time, there's a lot of new opportunities available too. And then the second piece of what I said about digital transformation is that there are these tectonic shifts towards the role of platforms, ecosystems, and digital business models. And you want to be paying attention to that. So my hope is that I've given you something to think about digital transformation. Maybe you knew all that. But this brings me to the other part of what I wanted to say, because there's a piece of that is of the world that is deeply married to this kind of digital transformation shift, and that is how innovation happens, the speed of innovation, the necessity for big companies to become simpler and faster and more agile. It's driven by a number of things. It's driven in part by the fast cycle of digital itself. If you think about a world of physical and analog products, you may create a product, and if you update it, you might update it once every few years or even once a decade. It depends on the speed of your industry. But in a digital world, things like apps are being developed 2 to 4 times, are being re-released, being updated 2 to 4 times a month. And you may say, oh yeah, well, I have analog products, I don't need to worry about it. But still, even the software in many of those products is being updated. And it's introducing this cycle, and a cycle that customers expect. They don't expect that you're going to fix a problem in 3 years when you release the next version of the product. They think it's going to happen right away. And if you don't believe that, you should take a ride inside of a Tesla. Teslas aren't perfect, but one of the things, the early Teslas, when they first released the Model S, had a problem with the windshield wipers. People are like, oh man, this is horrible. I can't believe this. I'm going to have to go back and get my car fixed at the repair shop. No, software release overnight fixed. Now, it can't happen for everything, but it's a new dimension or variable to physical products. And it's not just that. There's this wholesale adoption of a new set of tools for discovery. I mean, don't forget that Instagram was built and sold for $1 billion in 18 months. And they're not alone. There is a speed that is demanded to discover and execute opportunities that is increased, if not new. And so I want to talk to you about what's going on out there that's a little different than how we're used to operating in established companies, and how you can borrow that into what you do. To introduce that, I want to actually tell you the story of a startup. Jen Hyman was a student in my friend's class. She went home for the holidays and she saw a problem, an opportunity. Her younger sister had been invited to a wedding, but her younger sister's budget was out and she wanted a new dress. She wanted a new dress to appear in those darn Instagram photos, but she didn't have any money to buy a new dress. And so Jen Hyman has this idea. Why does my sister have to buy a dress? What if we could take designer dresses and use the internet the way that Netflix did when Netflix used to mail DVDs, but instead we'll mail dresses. You can go online, pick out a dress, receive it by mail, wear it for the special evening for a fraction of the price, and then return it by mail. And it's this idea she has. She wants to call this Rent the Runway. Now, I want you to imagine that if tomorrow morning, Jen Hyman goes to any big company in the world, to her manager, and says, hey, I got this really cool idea. What should I do next? What would that manager likely say? What advice would you get in a big company context? It would probably be something like, well, what's the business case? Fair enough. But, to answer that question, you would need to kind of come up with some assumptions about revenue, about expenses, about headcount. You need to create a big PowerPoint presentation with all this. You need to go through probably dozens of rounds of selling it and seeking approval and before you could even kind of get started. And so one of the things I really like about Jen Hyman's story about why it's so different is she doesn't do that. She doesn't write the business case. Now, that's not to say that planning is fundamentally wrong, but it is to say that she has a key untested assumption, a killer assumption, that if that assumption is wrong, that business case is a waste and will probably only serve to convince us of something that doesn't exist. And that assumption is this a problem worth solving? Like, if nobody's willing to pay you to do this, don't waste your time writing a business case. Now, the second thing I really like about Jen Hyman's story is how she goes about testing this assumption. She breaks it down into a testable hypothesis. Are women highly motivated to rent a designer dress for 1/10 the price? And then she designs a low-cost experiment to test that hypothesis. Now, myself, if left to my own devices, I probably would have thought, well, to test this hypothesis, I would need dresses. I don't own dresses, so I need to go buy them. I need to build a website. I'm not, it's been too long since I did coding to build a good website. So I need to go hire somebody. And now suddenly I need a lot of capital. And now I'm back to writing the business case so I can go get the capital to go do it. What Jen Hyman does is said, no. There's a faster, simpler way to test this hypothesis. Let's break it down into something smaller and even more testable. What does she do? She borrows dresses from friends. She sets up a kiosk on campus before one of the big dances, and she observes what happens. 35% of the women who come in to rent a dress, to see a dress, rent one, and 96% of women return it in good condition. Amazing. She has some data. Now, those of you who are maybe more scientists by training say, yeah, Nathan, but that's not what it's like online. Online, you can't try on a dress. Fair enough. Remember I said she was breaking it down, speeding up the cycle of testing. That's the essence. So she repeats the experiment. She borrows more dresses and she wants to test, can we develop an online solution? Will women rent it if they cannot try it on? As I said, she borrows more dresses. She goes down to Yale University. This time they can only see it, but not try it on. What happens? They come in, they see it, cannot try it on. 55% of the women who come in rent a dress. Now, that's not because of some sort of envy effect. It's because she's seeing the impact of inventory, of choice. And by the way, 100% of the women return the dress in good condition. Remember, Harvard was 96%. Maybe that's because Harvard's a party school and nobody's taking academics seriously. I mean, okay, I'm joking here, right? But the point is simply to say that she is running fast and low-cost experiments. She's getting directional data, and she repeats this cycle, one experiment after another. For example, you might say, yeah, but Nathan, these customers have a unique situation. They've been invited to a dance. I don't know about you guys, maybe you have great social lives, but I haven't been invited to a dance for decades, right? So that's not like my world. So she goes down to New York City. She identifies 1,000 women in her target market. She doesn't go build a website. She shows them pictures of dresses. Think how fast and low cost that is. You and I could print that up this afternoon, and we could be testing by dinner time. And what does she find? When women can only see the pictures, this general audience, 5% of the women rent a dress and 98% return in good condition. Again, the point is, low cost experiment, one after another. She goes on to build a business that is doing well over 100 million in revenue. And fun little piece of data, at Obama's second inauguration, 85% of the women were reportedly wearing Rent the Runway. I always like to joke that that at Trump's inauguration, not wanting to be outdone, 150% of the women were wearing Rent the Runway, which I think you can appreciate regardless of your political persuasions. But the point is simply, she does something really different here. She is running a very different cycle of experimentation, a very different way of working than we would use in a big company. And you might say, why, Nathan? Well, I would say, we like to use the S curve to map the maturity of a technology, a product, a company, or an industry. And on the left-hand side is this period of high uncertainty. Jen Hyman is clearly operating here. She doesn't know what problem she's really solving. She doesn't know what the business model should be, or even what the solution should be. As she figures it out, she will grow and scale and get in more of a repeat execution mode, this conditions of lower uncertainty, which is where most big companies operate. Now, why is this story important for you? It's important for you because uncertainty is increasing dramatically in the world around us. Every indicator I can find suggests this, the World Uncertainty Index. Even if you say, you look at the dominance of a big company. If you made it onto the S&P 500 list in the 1930s, you could expect to be on that list for 75 years based on historical data. If you made it onto that list today, you could only expect to be on the S&P 500 list for 12 years because your dominance is being challenged. So while big companies in the past were fine operating in this kind of classical management domain, sometimes what I call red management domain, increasingly they're finding themselves tossed back over to the left side, where they're under higher uncertainty and they're needing tools like Jen Hyman used, these entrepreneurial management tools. And my big message to you, my big first message to you about continuous innovation would be that there are two toolkits. I am not here to say that classical management is wrong. I'm here to say that classical management is right in certain circumstances, in low uncertainty contexts, where we're executing and doing the same thing over and over. But when we are launching a new product, a new service, a new internal HR initiative, a new geography, there are assumptions that are untested. We are in the entrepreneurial management domain, and we need to be applying these blue tools, these blue process tools. But in addition, as the overall pace of innovation increases, as the pace of industry change increases, it's getting harder and harder to operate as kind of a pure red company. More and more and more, you're needing to integrate blue tools to become simpler, faster, more agile. And so it's a more agile organization that is demanded even of established organizations. And I believe from my experience observing companies and studying them that this is possible. Now, you may say to me, Nathan, okay, I could believe it works for a startup renting dresses, but you don't understand, Nathan. We do high tech. We do stuff for applications where failure is unacceptable, with deep science, long R&D cycles, this couldn't apply here. Let me give you an example of these ideas applied to exactly this context. A big corporation that wanted to produce a multi-phase flow meter for the oil and gas industry. This is a very high precision device, very little room for failure once it's out in the field. So they had created a multi-year R&D program, a long list of things that needed to be investigated that the corporation didn't currently have to develop this high performance, high reliability, high precision device. One of my friends went in and began to work with them and to challenge that idea and to say, why don't you instead find the handful of your most desperate customers, the ones with the greatest need, and build a prototype with them, a minimum viable product. What's the minimum that would help us start learning today? In a co-creation, this is a B2B environment, a co-creation process to understand what it is we need to do to build a really great multi-phase flow meter. And so they do that. They worked with 6 customers. They built that first MVP, moving fast, deployed 6 units. And what do they discover when they deploy 6 units? Oh my gosh, that huge menu of R&D we thought we needed, we can cut it in half. We don't even need half that stuff. Customers don't care about it. It isn't relevant to the product. So they start those R&D items, and while they're doing it, they build a second MVP and they deploy 50 units. And they start learning by doing, and they take the lessons from that learning by doing, the insights from the R&D, they put it into a third MVP, deploy 400 units, and now this is a 100 million plus business. So it can apply. Now, I am not saying that it applies to every single thing. For example, nobody who wants to get on an airplane, when we start flying on airplanes again, that has a minimum viable product jet engine. Nobody wants to do that. I don't want to do that. But it doesn't mean you can't apply these ideas to the front end of the process to ask, how do we speed up the cycle? How do we more deeply understand what customers really want? And so, for example, I've gotten to spend some time with some of the innovators at Solvay and hear from them how they're trying to shift to ask the question, it's not just about creating a great technology, it's about what are its uses and what are its applications. So you can find a little bit more about this process that we wrote about in the book, The Innovator's Method. That was one of the books that Mark showed. I'll have to send him a check later and as a thank you. But before I leave you, I want to just leave you with something super practical and tangible, because it's not just about process. It is about that, of course, that matters. Culture matters, leadership matters. And if we had more time, I would talk to you about that. But I just want to talk to you about the work we did on the behaviors of innovative leaders, something you could take away right now. And this was inspired by this huge survey of global CEOs in which IBM asked, what's the single most important competency you're looking for today? And the answer was creative leadership. Because in this fast-moving, ambiguous environment, quickly changing, creativity is really important. And I have some great empirics that support this, that being creative, being innovative, once you kind of meet the bar for performance, being creative and innovative accelerates your career trajectory more than just execution. But this can put us in a bind. Some of us think, well, I'm not a very creative person. Some of us say, yeah, I'm totally creative. But I have some bad news for both of you. Maybe it's good news. And that is that when we study creativity, let's say, for example, in a study of genetically identical twins, separated at birth, raised in different environments, what percentage of creativity appears to be genetic? Only 33% or less. The rest of it is behaviors and context, which means that you and the teams you lead have so much more creative capacity than you might realize. So what we did is we studied these, one of the many things we did is study these innovators to say, well, okay, if it's not how they were born, what is it they do? What are their behaviors? And we identified 5 behaviors that help these leaders to be more creative. And by the way, I will say really quickly, one of my other co-authors is an applied neuroscientist. So he actually does like fMRI EEG headsets, electroencephalography headsets, like watching people's brains activity. And he can verify using these applied neuroscience tools that simply explaining the elements of creativity to people increases their ability to generate new ideas 30% on average. So what are these 5 behaviors? Well, there's this associating, putting different things together, which is this cognitive skill that tends to lead to new ideas. And it's fed by 4 discovery behaviors: questioning, observing, experimenting, and networking. And in my last handful of minutes, I just want to give you examples and show you how you can apply this. So I talked about associating. That is putting at the core of innovation, the essence of innovation and creativity, is putting different ideas together. Steve Jobs used to say, creativity is connecting things. Creative people connect experiences they've had and synthesize new things. I'll give you an example of what we've done at one of the projects we've been involved with at INSEAD. One of the challenges in some parts of the world is that in some very poor parts of the world, it's hard for folks to get to a doctor because they don't have the money or the time to take a bus to get to the doctor. What if instead of making people come to the city for the doctor, we put the doctor's clinic in a container, standard container, easily shipped, and brought the clinics to them? That's the essence of the idea, what is the Ujani Clinic, bringing the healthcare to people. You may say, oh, Nathan, that feels cool. That's cool. I'm happy, but that's far removed from my world. Well, if you go back to AeroFlot, the essence of the AeroFlot transformation was borrowing ideas from other industries and within industries and recombining them. The second behavior is being willing to question. Who ask questions that challenge the status quo. They say, what if, why not, how come? Great example of this, Edwin Land, developer of the Polaroid instant camera. Some of you may remember the question that sparked this kind of transformational innovation. It was his 3-year-old daughter asking, why can't I see the pictures right away? Now, Edwin Land was a very technical person. He could have explained, well, honey, it's because photography involves a series of chemical baths, blah, blah, blah. Instead, he said, why not? And in 2.5 years, they developed the camera that outlived the company. Third behavior, observing. Observing the world around you. So let me back up a minute. I always wanted to help you understand how you could apply this. Association. One of the best things you can do is try to start borrowing ideas from the world around you. Second, on questioning, we can actually develop the habit of asking questions, challenging the status quo, asking how it could be different. The third thing we can do is to try to open our eyes up to the world around us. You may think you know everything about the world around you. Let me tell you a story that maybe kind of opens your mind a little bit. Some of my former executive students were working at Kimberly-Clark professional division. They are in the very sexy business of selling paper towels. It is not the most complicated business in the world, right? I think we all know how the paper towels in the bathroom work. I hope we do. They had just closed a big contract with a hospital network. They were celebrating. There was no reason why you would ever go back and observe how paper towels are being used in the bathroom. I mean, give me a break. What's there to learn? Except one person did. And he went back and he saw, oh my gosh, they're not using the paper towels the way they're supposed to. They're not just in the bathrooms. They're also in meeting rooms, on the nurse's trolley. They're gathering dust, they're spilling. And he goes to the administrator and says, hey, you got this problem going on. I could sell you this heavy duty dispenser that would allow you to not waste so many paper towels. And the administrator's like, oh, how much are those? About 30 euros. Oh, that's not going to work. Way too much. We need thousands of these. So my friend didn't give up. He went back out to packaging goods companies and looked around, and he came up with this clear, transparent case. It's manufactured and ships flat. So it costs about $1 to make and ship. It folds up very easily to just the right size. So only Kimberly-Clark paper towels fit inside. Good little bit of strategy. And now you see these all over the hospital. So if you can find opportunities by observing in paper towels, my guess is there's opportunities in other domains. And by the way, nobody's above this. You know, you've probably been to Starbucks. Howard Schultz is the founder of Starbucks. He used to go to Starbucks stores 25 times a week, decades into his tenure as the founder and CEO of Starbucks. Third, experimenting. The innovators we studied were willing to try new things. Robin Chase is an entrepreneur who introduced a car sharing service back in the year 2000 when car sharing wasn't something that was popular. And she struggled to get people on board, investors and customers, until she started experimenting with how she all kinds of things. But one of them was, how do I describe this business? And what she realized is when you say car sharing, people have these negative associations with it. Like, imagine I described a hotel as bed sharing. You don't really want to stay in a hotel anymore, do you? So she started to write down different ways to describe this business on index cards and experiment until she discovered this best way to describe the business. And she said, it's like an ATM. You know how that lets you get cash when you want it? This is wheels when you want them. And she went on and built Zipcar, which was ultimately sold for $500 million. Last of the 5 behaviors is networking. But by networking, I mean something different than handing out your business card. So if we look at innovation versus execution-oriented leaders, they both network. The difference is that innovation-oriented leaders network for ideas, whereas execution-oriented leaders network for resources. What does that mean? Well, if you are looking for ideas, you talk to people who are different than you. You actually go out of your way to find people with different perspectives. Whereas if you're only going after resources, you tend to target people with power and position, people who are like you. So I described 5 behaviors that you can adopt now that you can foster in your teams. You know, if you have a challenge, go out to other industries that have solved similar challenges and borrow their ideas. That is the essence of association. That is the essence of innovation. Question, observe the world around you, and be willing to experiment. In summary, what have I talked today about? I talked about digital transformation as transforming the core to do what you do better with digital tools and chasing new opportunities. I mentioned the role of platforms, ecosystems, and digital business models. And then I said, paired with that is this need for continuous innovation. And I talked about this process of identifying killer assumptions, developing hypotheses like the scientists that many of you are at heart, but then using a cycle of low-cost experiments with customers to test those assumptions. And then lastly, I talked about 5 behaviors that you can adopt to help you just be more innovative in your thinking right now. And those were associating, questioning, observing, experimenting, and networking. And I would say, if you want to be a path breaker in your industry, don't just look at what others are doing in your industry. Look at industries who are ahead of you on the innovation process, the digital transformation curve that are similar to you. Network for ideas, borrow those back into your industry, and you'll appear a superstar.